Thank you so much for joining us today for our newly rebranded podcast, Revise and Resubmit. If you haven't listened to the intro to season 2, go back and listen to it, and you'll hear more about why we changed our name. I'm Dr. Kim Bissell, the Southern Progress Endowed Professor in Magazine Journalism and the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Communication and Information Sciences at the University of Alabama.
Wow, season 2, yay! I'm up for our first episode to air today. I'm Dr. Annalisa Bowen, an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies, also at the University of Alabama, and we both work in the Institute for Communication and Information Research, or the ICIR, at UA.
Did you know that Sesame Street had advertising? Do you pay attention to what your kids are watching or streaming on iPads? I mean, let's be honest. Maybe we do, but do we also pay attention to the ads our kids are exposed to? I was so proud of myself because I thought I totally had a handle on what my kids were watching while they were growing up, but I didn't even think about the ads.
I mean, I grew up watching Sesame Street, and are you sure there are ads? I don't remember that. And now I'm questioning how I was influenced by Sesame Street beyond like ABCs and 1, 2, 3s and all the other educational material that is on that show. Our next guest does pay attention to the ads, and he is going to share with us some of the way that kiddos are exposed to advertising that might be a little bit more hidden. And he's also going to talk to us about kids and social media. Dr. Steve Holliday is an assistant professor in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations, and his area of research focus is children and media. And we'd like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Steve Holliday.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Steve.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with y'all.
All right, Steve. So first, can you tell our listeners briefly about who you are and where you're from?
Yeah. So my name's Stephen Holliday. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations at the University of Alabama, where I've been since the fall of 2018, so a couple years now. I'm originally from Colorado, and I received my master's degree from Brigham Young University and my PhD from Texas Tech University. So I've moved around the West quite a bit before coming here. And I also spent about 6 years in the industry doing marketing and advertising work.
And when do you think your Southern accent is going to emerge?
So the y'all and the fixin' tos, I have fully embraced those, which is crazy because when I first started teaching my students, I used to say you guys all the time because that's what we say out West. Mm-hmm. And somewhere along the line in my education, I started realizing maybe that's a little sexist or preferential without me even realizing it. So I fully embraced y'all now because I feel safe with that.
I like it.
So, Steve, I'm going to fess up and let you know that I was stalking you on social media just a little bit, and I saw that you have 2 of the most beautiful kiddos and really these amazing photos of them. And don't worry, for our initial question, we're not going to ask you to pick a favorite kiddo. But I do want to know, how has school been going for you and your family with 2 school-age kids, balancing virtual, hybrid, and in person for them?
You know, the shelter in place was a unique challenge. And I think so many of us experienced it and encountered it that I don't feel unique in when I explain it to people because I'm around parents all the time and families. And so I'm always surprised. I'm like, oh yeah, no, a lot of us are going through this, but I know there are a lot that aren't as well. And so when we entered the shelter in place, completely kind of threw off how I had negotiated my time and my space, because we were all stuck in the house together, right? Mm-hmm. We were all hanging out together, and my kids, I felt guilty if I was out with my kids and I wasn't taking care of my students and my course and my research enough. And when I was doing that, my kids were like wanting to play board games or play in the yard and stuff. And so I was pulled in multiple directions. So I had to renegotiate this time and space a little bit. But ultimately, I think the shelter in place and the quarantine periods that followed brought us closer as a family. I love the time that we spent this summer. We spent some time doing things that we never get around to, like getting out in nature and hiking. and going on picnics and things and spending some quality family time together. I do, like you said, I have a 12-year-old daughter and a 7-year-old son, and I love the time I spent with them. And I think that kind of fuels a lot of my research that I do too, that we'll talk about today. But getting back in this fall, I mean, there's a lot of people that are sheltered in place or that are still quarantining for health concerns and those kind of things, right? But as a parent, like, there's only a limited amount of that you can do when your kids don't fully understand what this pandemic is.
Right.
And so we're back in school. Our kids go to school physically in person. My son plays baseball. Plays Little League baseball. And it's a lot more thin than it was last fall. Less people, more distancing. People are just more conscientious. But we're negotiating this new world and kind of trying to do it as a family and find ways to enjoy it as we look at, like, this is our new pattern of life and kind of what we're going at.
Well, I like the approach that you take into this, and I really can appreciate the fact that I think it's really easy to kind of get down and think, when is this going to end? And this is so stressful. And it sounds like because you all have embraced it, it's really just helped the whole family dynamic. So thank you for sharing that. Now we're actually getting back to podcast questions and your research.
Well, and they dovetail so much that, like, I could talk about either one all day because they're all going to interweave, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right.
So why don't you give us that elevator pitch on your research?
Yeah, so I guess, obviously, I'm an advertising scholar. Most of my research, I say that, but I do have some hobby horses that I started off with in political communication and in selfies that are out there as well. But most of my research is in advertising and advertising history and advertising effects. I use surveys, I use experiments, and I even use historiography, or the historical method, to examine persuasive messaging that's directed towards children and parents. So I've examined programming like Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood and Sesame Street and even Jack and Jill magazine, formatting like addressable advertising and influencer marketing and cause advertising. And then I look at the psychological processes of socio-emotional development, the construction of the consumer identity, and how we engage with advertising to tell stories to children and their parents as well.
So I would love even though you have an ad PR background, I'm going to ask you to shift over into the journalism camp. Could you maybe give us a headline for what you consider to be one of your most interesting study findings?
Yeah, I think that there's a project that I'm deeply immersed in right now. So that kind of consumes all my attention. And so that immediately comes to mind. And in history, it made sense as I go back and read history, but I don't think we think of it this way. So my headline is, Sesame Street has advertising.
Oh, I love it. Okay, so you're going to have to elaborate on that.
Yeah, it blew my mind, right? Like, this idea that when we see Sesame Street, we think that it's on public television. There's no advertising in it. You've got just almost an hour of this programming that is intensely focused on educating children, right? That's what we're used to, right? And so, but as I looked into it and started reading some history books, I found these mentions, and they were just on the edges of the pages, and some history books about Sesame Street, maybe like a paragraph here or a passing reference there that says, hey, those in the middle of the Sesame Street narrative, you've got the 12-minute, you've got like 10 to 12 minutes where you have Sesame, where you have Big Bird and you have Grover and you have Cookie Monster, and they're living on the street in this narrative. And then after that, every so often, we get these 3 or 4 minute breaks where there's these little animated and live action segments that are about 30 to 60 minutes long. And in the history of Sesame Street and the fringes of these histories, they would call these letter commercials.
Wow.
And so when I saw them, I was like, are we just calling them commercials, or are we actually using commercial strategy and advertising theory? And so that's what I've been digging into a little bit, is going into historical archives and identifying that Sesame Street actually hired advertising professionals and advertising executives to help them construct these with the same persuasive effectiveness that you use to sell cereal and you use to sell laundry soap, with the same components, so that they could sell the letter L and the number 2 to children in a way that would make them and want to engage with them and remember them and talk to their parents about them. Blew my mind.
Wow.
Yeah. So when you first mentioned that, I was like, where is the iPad placement in Sesame Street? Is that what you're talking about? And so I guess what you're saying too is that all of us need to have these advertising and PR strategies to sell our students on the concepts that we teach them too.
Yeah, some of the most basic and fundamental teaching. And that's as I went through the literature and the research, even on the education side and children's literacy side. And I'd find that there would be people saying that Sesame Street stole this from Madison Avenue, this approach. And then other people would be like, well, Madison Avenue stole it from elementary school teachers.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So, but you're right, Annalisa. We do also see throughout, especially in more recent years, we see in advertising that you'll occasionally, to teach children the letter K, they'll use Super K cereal instead of Special K cereal, or they'll use Girl Scout cookies instead of Girl Scout cookies.
Oh my goodness. Who knew? Who knew? So can you tell us a little bit about like the nature of the work that you do? When you gave us kind of the elevator pitch, you talked about different methodologies, but can you break that down a little bit in terms of what data collection looks like for you? Because I know that you do work with families and with young kids, and can you explain to our listeners just how that all looks in a non-COVID setting, I guess?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think and this was especially moving into COVID. This was, and into the pandemic, this was one of the things that I quickly had to negotiate, because a lot of my work that I love doing, some of the foundational work I love doing, is the hands-on work with children and families. Now, I'm an advertising professional by background, and also a lot of the advertising research and scale development and stuff, a lot of the empirical work that we do begins with very qualitative methods. A lot of people will use focus groups, they'll use interviews to tap into these phenomena and these concepts that they later then want to understand how they generalizably or more generalizably influence a population. And so using those qualitative methods is very common in more quantitative research. My qualitative piece that I begin with is historical. I love digging into archives and looking at the background of different advertising phenomena, or different ways that people respond to different advertising messaging. And if there are different types of messaging, how those came about. And so I'll look at those kind of things, but then I like to take them and I like to produce them in a laboratory. And I shouldn't say I love the laboratory. I like the laboratory. It came about out of necessity, though, because you can't give a survey or an online experiment or survey to 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old children who I love to work with, right?
Right.
And so I had to get in and be able to assess these children in hands-on, in person, be able to acknowledge that these children have limitations in their verbalization and in their vocabulary that makes it so they don't know what you mean when you say strongly agree or strongly disagree, right? I mean, it doesn't mean anything to them.
Right.
And so getting at how can I tap into that and get them to express how they feel about something takes in-person, hands-on, emotional connection with those children. And so I love to go in with the parents and the children and interact and see how they respond to different types of advertising, or how they respond to their parents' responses to advertising. And so I do use that, the data that comes from that, just like I would a survey with measures and items that I can then go in and analyze and statistically, inferentially identify trends and things like that.
So, Steve, to follow up on something that you had just said about kind of the common response options that we see in surveys or experiments with adults, strongly agree to strongly disagree, do you use smiley faces or unhappy faces? I mean, how do you gauge or record the children's responses to these ads? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So to there, I'm amazed constantly when I even tried to, even as a student, or even sometimes I'll catch myself with children, and I'll ask them like, even words that you use like sometimes or perhaps. A child doesn't know what the word perhaps means. And I know that sounds crazy, but like I've had so many children sit in a lab or I've seen them sitting in labs, and someone will give them a response option. I've caught myself doing it where I use a response option. How much have you ever done this? And one of the response options is perhaps. And they're like, I don't know what that means. They're like, what does perhaps mean?
Right.
And we take them for granted. And then, but also children sometimes don't want to say the word agree with you. They want to like look at you, but they'll point at things like crazy. So I'll use, sometimes we'll use these color gradients that have, if I want to get from a negative to a positive response option, I'll use a color gradient that starts with a cooler color and goes to a warmer color and let them point at where they feel like they're on the spectrum. Or agree and disagree, I might use frowny faces or neutral faces and then smiley faces. But my favorite to use are hand puppets. And that's kind of just the thing I've grown attached to. And so even in our lab, we have a bunch of hand puppets because I get that too. And as a kid, I would respond well to hand puppets. And with the hand puppet, you have two hand puppets on your hands, and these hand puppets actually talk to the children. And they say, you ask them the question and you say, hey, these are my two friends. And this friend says, I feel this way, which would be more in line with a disagreement with the statement. The other one says, I feel this way. And then you ask the child, which one is more like you? And the children, you as a researcher, it's fascinating how the researcher whose head is in between those two puppets completely disappears. And they talk to these hand puppets, and the hand puppets, if they have personalities and voices, which we do, with them, they'll point to them and they'll identify with one that gets how negative they feel in certain situations or how positive they feel towards something else in other situations.
I mean, that's so cool, and it's got to be so much work in the preparation of it. But thank you for that explanation. That's just fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of research, and it's built on this solid foundation of research that says when we're talking to adolescents and children, we've got to adapt our measures in a different way. And there's lots of researchers that will have children illustrate their thoughts and responses instead of trying to speak out their responses and stuff like that. And it's really involved research is what it ends up being, because your planning stage and making sure you're meticulously tapping into the right concept, and you're trying to, in a way that a child will actually understand it and be able to respond. And then the sheer amount of time it takes to have a single child in there doing that. Right. It's involved.
I'm sure.
So I'm the child of a researcher, and growing up, I would be the pilot, and I would have to do surveys to make sure that they were on a level that a child could understand, and I'd have to give feedback. And I thought, there's another survey, but like now look at that, I'm using that experience in a podcast, and I do remember it, and I think that kind of gives me an appreciation, a different appreciation of what researchers go through. Do you ever involve your children in piloting?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because sometimes I feel like I abuse my children when it comes to this. My children are the first participants in every research project that I do. But my children love it though, because sometimes like I'll bring the puppets home, and my children will like want to sleep with them as their new stuffed animals and stuff. And or if I'm researching like toys like Shopkins, like right now I've got boxes of Shopkins toys, and my children are like, "Oh, we're gonna sit and play with these until you use them as measures." And I'm like, "Okay." Yeah. But then also, yes, there are times where I will sit down, and if I'm trying to tap into my children's perspective taking or their emotional responses and emotional capability, I'll start those. And a lot of those are task-based games that are like riddles. And so my children love playing those. They love sitting down with me and seeing what riddle does daddy have that I need to solve, that I need to figure out, And I tell parents all the time, I was like, there's no right or wrong answers to these, but it helps me to understand how cognitively developed your child is and their ability to take other people's perspective or understand what an advertiser is trying to seek from them. But yeah, my children love playing those games too.
I mean, I'm not going to lie. I, do work with adolescent girls, and the number of surveys I had my daughter fill out and send it to her friends, and it's like, please help. So yeah, I've abused my kids in that way as well.
Well, and also, I mean, I don't mean to turn this, but Dr. Bissell, I think the support at our labs, your background was studying children, and our late great friend Dr. Bryant's work in working with children in our research institute is a phenomenal support for this kind of research. And so that's why I'm excited to be here, because from the day I showed up, the spaces and the resources we're developing some as we move into a more digital age, and as we move into more contemporary types of interactions that we need with children that we didn't even understand 20 years ago when Dr. Bryant started doing his work. But we have a tremendous asset and tremendous advocate for this type of work through you and the Institute and our heritage there.
Well, thank you. So, okay, we have to ask, I mean, with what you do and your background in advertising, it seems like there's a pretty direct application of your work. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah. So somebody just asked me this question the other day, and I've never thought of myself as a critical scholar. But a lot of my implications have to do with being very critical of the advertising industry, even though my background is in the advertising industry, and I specifically worked in this segment of the industry that had target audiences of mothers of children. And so I understood how we were speaking to these people. But I have children of my own. And so I need to be and so I've become more conscientious of the messages we use, everything from product placement in children's picture books to the branding that we include in mommy Instagram influencers feeds. And so I've become a little more aware of this, but I think the implication of my work that I try to do is I like to start conversations. My wife will tell me this all the time. She says, you are an instigator. You are the devil's advocate in every conversation. And that's where I want to be. I want to have these conversations. So yes, some of my findings and implications because of my background in advertising benefit advertisers and help them understand consumer psychology and how to more effectively use advertising strategy to speak to parents and children. But some of my implications also, I try to balance that and arm parents and advocates with insights on how advertising is speaking to them so that they can become more conscientious consumers. I think that we all started as children, and so we're all on this consumer development path. But I mean, even as we become parents, our identity changes from when we were a single adult. And so or a married adult even. And so we need to understand what advertising is doing, and then we need to have conversations about whether we want to. I don't think all advertising is negative. And when we say that we want you to be a critical consumer, I don't think that means we want you to be a negative consumer. We just want you to be a literate consumer. I want people, parents and children, to be more literate consumers who understand that, hey, this advertisement wants me to like this product. Is it a product I'm in the market for and want to like, or are they manipulating me? And be able to conscientiously make those decisions.
So it sounds like to me that this research is not happening in a day. And so we're going to shift gears slightly, but can you tell us about just the process of getting a study from, I mean, not only just doing the study, but then writing about it, and how the process is and how you cope with submitting an article and then revising it again maybe, and then revising it and revising it again maybe, and how do you negotiate that and persist through the publishing process?
So I learned rejection at a very early age in academics. And if you can learn that and just bite that bullet and just let the rejections flow for a little bit, eventually you start seeing them as like, you know what? I can use this to strengthen it. But it's a hard pill to swallow when you first start in academics.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite reviewer?
I love Reviewer 1 because they make me feel all nice. Reviewer 2 always makes me want to set aside the whole review for like a month if they give me 3 months or 2 months to make their revisions.
Right.
But then I end up coming back, and those are the ones that make it the strongest article, right? But no, I mean, to answer your question before though, I think coping, right now with my research, I struggle because I can't have those child participants in a lab right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I can't engage with them. And we're starting to go back into a version of the world where I can, and we've had those conversations of where we could possibly start to do that. But now you have the consideration, I'm dealing with children.
Right.
Children need to be able to see your mouth. Children need to be able to be in close proximity with you. And so, especially younger children. And so a lot of the development of my research, yes, takes a long time, but it takes a lot longer when I can't carry it out to its final expectations in the current circumstances. But the research, when we're developing research, it takes. I mean, the IRB process with working with children takes a little while, right? I mean, you know that, Dr. Bissell, right?
I sure do. Yay, IRB.
Yeah, and knock on wood, I think the IRB process has been, I'm not taking blood samples from children or anything. And so it hasn't been too arduous, overwhelmingly arduous, but it takes a while. Mm-hmm. And then it takes a while to develop those kind of measures that tap into who the children are. And then recruiting. You'd think there's lots of parents in a community, but finding parents who have the time and the hours they can actually bring their children, unless those children aren't in school physically, is really, there's some juggling that has to be done. And so they're actually a difficult population to tap into. And so the collection process with children and parents and bringing, since they have to be in person, takes a while. And so, I mean, before the pandemic, we were about 4 months into data collection. But that was after over a year of planning and preparation to be able to open those labs and bring those participants in. And so that part of the process takes a long time. But then also when it comes to research with children, a lot of times in my process, I like to start by understanding how the parent thinks before, how they proactively respond to those things that children are going to respond to. So in some of these studies, I like to have 2 different steps to it, or 2 different studies within these projects that look at who is the parent and how does the parent feel and how does that media motivate and influence the parent's thoughts and feelings and behaviors, and then turn around and say, okay, I understand how the parent feels. Now let's see if the child's response warrants that kind of response from children.
Right. Well, so Steve, we always like to end our conversations, and quite frankly, I think we could talk to you for another hour about all this. It's just so fascinating. But what we like to do is kind of end on a positive note, and quite frankly, I'm trying to collect information for possible places to add to my bucket list. As academics, we have the really good fortune of being able to travel to different countries and different cities to present our research. So what is a favorite place that you visited when you've traveled to present your research, or a place that you're looking forward to visiting?
I was looking forward to a lot of places this last year. From some of my historical research to our International Communication Association, places like Australia and even Memphis and New Orleans and a lot of these places we have on our things would be fascinating. But no, I loved, so far the places I've been, I love Chicago.
Yeah,
Right? There's so much there culturally, and there's so much energy there.
Yeah.
And so even as just a tourist going there, I feel like, or even like somebody that, even if I don't get a chance on sometimes when I go there to actually go out, if I'm stuck in like a library looking at archives or something, or if I'm at a conference there, like what's going on in that city feeds my energy and my soul, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But then also people, when they come there, also feel that way. And so I feel like the energy, anytime I've been there, the energy at those conferences just seems lively and seems kind of like just fun.
Oh, it totally does. I love Chicago, and I love it when we have conferences there. Mm-hmm. Steve, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you. We've learned so much about your research, and it's just been really kind of fun and exciting to get a deeper dive into what you do. So thank you so much for joining us today.
I really appreciate it. It has been a pleasure to talk to y'all, and I hope that the year as we go through and start to piece our lives back together and explore all the research we're all doing inspires and somehow helps somebody to find an agenda that they can move forward with in our environment.
I love that.
Yes. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you.